Imagine walking through a quiet forest when, out of nowhere, you hear desperate, gut-wrenching barks echoing through the trees. A cry for help you can't ignore. What would you do? This is the story of one man who couldn't walk away from the suffering of an innocent creature, a pit bull bound by chains to a tree, left there to die. But as he steps forward to rescue her, he unwittingly steps into a nightmare that will change everything. A pit bull, chained to a tree, a cruel act of heartless violence, but little did he know, the true test of courage was only just beginning. Before we dive into the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Ethan had always found peace in the quiet of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the fresh, earthy smell of pine had a way of soothing his restless mind. It was his sanctuary, a place to escape from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Today, like every other Saturday, he set out for a long walk through the woods, hoping for some clarity. As he walked deeper into the dense forest, something caught his attention. A sound, a faint but unmistakable noise that stood out against the usual harmony of nature. It was a bark, but not the playful bark of a dog running through the grass. This was a desperate bark, filled with pain and fear. The sound sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He paused, listening intently. The barking continued, a series of sharp, urgent calls that echoed through the trees. Ethan's heart raced, his instincts pulling him toward the source of the sound. He started walking faster, his feet moving almost instinctively toward the direction of the cries. As he pushed through the underbrush, the trees began to thin, and the forest opened up to a small clearing. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes fell upon the scene before him. A pit bull, a beautiful dog with a glossy mahogany coat, was chained to a large oak tree. The chain was thick, cruelly tight around her neck, and it was clear she had been there for some time. Her body was thin, ribs showing beneath the skin, and her eyes were wide with fear. She pulled against the chain, her barking frantic, but the more she struggled, the tighter the chain seemed to pull. Ethan stood frozen, his heart breaking for the dog. She was trapped, helpless, alone in this desolate place. He could see the wear and tear on her paws, the dirt and blood from trying to break free. The fur around her neck was matted with sweat, her body trembling from exhaustion. What kind of person could do this to a defenseless animal? Ethan's mind raced with anger and disbelief. He glanced around, searching for any sign of the person responsible for this cruelty. But the forest was empty, silent, save for the desperate whimpers of the pit bull. Ethan knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to help her. But first he needed to figure out how to get the chain off. He approached cautiously, speaking softly to the dog, trying to calm her down. "It's okay, girl. I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. The dog's eyes locked onto his, a flicker of hope amid the fear. She stopped barking for a moment, just watching him, and then, as if sensing his kindness, she lowered her head slightly. Ethan took a step closer, reaching out a hand, his fingers brushing against her fur. She flinched at first, but then leaned into his touch, her body relaxing ever so slightly. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for the chain around her neck, examining it closely. It was old, rusted, and thick, too thick for him to break with his hands alone. He looked around for something to help him, anything that could give him an advantage. That's when his gaze landed on a rusty old hatchet lying discarded on the ground nearby. The sight of it made his heart sink. Someone had left this here, not far from the suffering animal. Grabbing the hatchet, Ethan returned to the dog, his resolve strengthening with each passing second. He swung the blade carefully at the chain, feeling the metal resist with every strike. The pit bull watched him, her eyes filled with a quiet trust, that made Ethan's heart ache. It wasn't until the third strike that the chain finally snapped, the metal falling to the ground with a clatter. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, but he wasn't done yet. He gently took hold of the dog's collar and helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she wobbled on her shaky legs. "Come on, girl. Let's get you out of here," he whispered, his voice full of determination. The dog whimpered softly, her tail giving a hesitant wag. She was free at last, but as Ethan turned to leave, a strange feeling washed over him. A sense of danger lingered in the air, like something was watching. He shook it off, focusing on getting the dog to safety, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something terrible was about to happen. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step he took with the pit bull by his side felt heavier, more uncertain. The forest around him, once peaceful, now seemed to hum with an eerie tension. The snap of a twig behind him only intensified his sense of unease. He glanced over his shoulder, his breath shallow. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly, but no one was there. Still, the sense of being followed lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. The pit bull walked slowly beside him, her body still trembling from the ordeal. Her once lustrous coat was matted and dirty, her steps weak but determined. Ethan's heart ached for her, and he couldn't help but reach down to gently stroke her head, offering whatever comfort he could. She looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude, and for a moment the tension in his chest eased. But then a sound shattered the stillness of the woods, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere. Ethan's spine stiffened, his eyes darting around in search of the source. The dog's ears perked up at the sound, and she froze, her body tense. "Stay close," Ethan whispered to her, his voice low but firm. He tightened his grip on the hatchet he had used to free her, unsure of what they were up against. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and fast. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, dressed in camouflage and holding a rifle. His eyes were cold and narrow, and the way he looked at Ethan made it clear that he was not a friend. The man's gaze shifted to the pit bull, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," the man said, his voice thick with disdain. "Looks like someone decided to play hero." Ethan's stomach churned. He recognized this man. He had seen him around town, an outsider with a reputation for cruelty and a love of hunting. But what Ethan didn't know was that this man had a darker side, one that involved more than just hunting animals. The pit bull growled low, her hackles raised, but she was still too weak to do anything more than stand her ground. Ethan could feel the fear radiating from her, but he stood firm, not willing to back down. "Get away from us," Ethan said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're the one who did this to her, aren't you?" The man chuckled darkly, his grip on the rifle tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about. She's just a dog, a worthless mutt." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could feel his blood boiling, his protective instincts flaring up. He wasn't going to let this man hurt the pit bull again, not after everything she had been through. "I'm taking her with me," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "You can't keep her chained up like that. You don't deserve to have a dog." The man's smile faltered for a moment, and a flash of anger crossed his face. "You think you can just walk off with my property? You don't know who you're dealing with." Before Ethan could react, the man raised the rifle, pointing it directly at him. Time seemed to slow as Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The pit in his stomach grew heavier, the weight of the moment settling in. Ethan instinctively stepped in front of the pit bull, his body a shield between her and the hunter. He knew he had no weapon, no way to fight back against a man with a rifle, but he refused to let fear control him. "I won't let you hurt her anymore," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "This ends now." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ethan thought he might pull the trigger. The tension in the air was thick, the forest holding its breath, as though even nature itself knew what was about to unfold. Then the pit bull did something unexpected. With a sudden burst of energy, she lunged forward, her teeth bared, and before anyone could react, she had closed the distance between them. The hunter's rifle flew from his hands as the pit bull knocked him to the ground, her powerful jaws sinking into his arm. The man screamed in pain, but the pit bull held her ground, her eyes fierce and protective. Ethan could hardly believe what he was seeing. This dog, who had been so weak and broken just moments ago, was now a force to be reckoned with. The hunter struggled beneath her, but the pit bull refused to back down. She growled, a sound that resonated with pure fury. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the dog wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting him, too. With a final, desperate effort, the hunter managed to push the dog off of him. Blood dripped from his arm, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away slowly. His eyes were wild with fear and pain, his breath ragged. You'll regret this," he spat, his voice filled with venom. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was locked on the pit bull, who stood between him and the hunter, her stance strong and unyielding. Ethan's heart swelled with pride and awe. This dog, once a victim of unimaginable cruelty, had become his savior. The hunter turned and fled into the woods, his retreating footsteps echoing through the trees. Ethan stood still for a moment, taking in the gravity of what had just happened. The pit bull, though still shaky, was now standing tall, her body filled with purpose. "You did it," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The dog looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and in that moment Ethan knew that their bond had been sealed. He wasn't just her rescuer anymore, he was her protector, and she was his. Ethan and the pit bull stood there in the clearing, the echoes of the hunter's footsteps fading into the distance. The weight of the moment began to settle around them like a heavy fog. The dog, still tense, kept her gaze fixed on the path where the man had disappeared. Her breathing was ragged, and her body still trembled slightly from the confrontation. But beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was something else, a fierce determination, a bond that neither of them had anticipated, but now could not be broken. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse still racing. He had no idea what had just happened. The hunter's retreat was too quick, too unplanned. He was a man who wouldn't just let something like this slide. The threat wasn't over, and deep down, Ethan knew that the hunter would be back. But now, more than ever, Ethan was determined to keep the pit bull safe. "Let's go," he said, his voice rough but resolute. He took a step forward, and the pit bull followed closely behind, her steps slower than his but unwavering. She was still weak, but she had gained some strength from the fight. Ethan could feel it. The bond between them was already growing. What had started as a rescue mission was now something much more. She was no longer just an animal in need. She was a companion, a protector in her own right. They moved through the woods cautiously, with Ethan scanning every shadow and every rustle of the leaves. It was strange. He had always found the forest comforting, but now it felt like a labyrinth of hidden dangers. He couldn't help but feel that the hunter wasn't finished. He had to be sure they got out safely, but every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into an unknown world of danger. As they walked, Ethan tried to focus on the dog. Her condition was worse than he had initially thought. Her ribs were still visible under her fur, and her legs wobbled with each step. Despite the adrenaline of the rescue, she was barely able to keep up. He couldn't let her suffer like this, not after everything she'd already been through. "Hold on," Ethan murmured. "We're almost there." It wasn't much further until they would reach the edge of the forest, where the road was, where safety awaited. Ethan had promised himself he would get her to a vet, get her the care she needed. But as they walked, the feeling of being followed returned, sharper now, more urgent. The hair on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. He stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The hunter was close. Ethan's grip tightened on the hatchet. This time he wasn't going to just stand there. He glanced at the pit bull. She was alert now, her head turning from side to side as if she too could sense the growing danger. Her muscles tensed beneath her thin coat, her body low to the ground, ready for whatever was coming next. She wasn't weak anymore. She was no longer the scared, trembling dog chained to a tree. She was a fighter. Ethan crouched beside her, placing a hand on her back. "Stay close," he whispered. The woods were silent now, the usual sounds of birds and insects strangely absent. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. A faint sound reached his ears. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind them. Someone was moving through the woods, careful not to make a sound, but Ethan could hear the crunch of leaves beneath heavy boots. The hunter was back. The pit bull growled low, her body vibrating with tension. Ethan stood up quickly, positioning himself in front of her, ready to face whatever came next. He could hear the man now, closer than ever. He had to act fast. Suddenly the hunter emerged from the trees, his face twisted with anger, his eyes wild with rage. He was holding a knife now, the blade gleaming in the dim light filtering through the canopy. He must have dropped the rifle earlier. But Ethan knew that this new weapon was just as dangerous, perhaps more so. "You really thought you could get away with this?" the hunter sneered. "You should have stayed out of it." Ethan didn't respond. He knew there was no reasoning with a man like this. He stepped back, positioning himself between the hunter and the dog. "Stay away from her." The hunter's eyes flicked to the pit bull, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something. Fear in the hunter's gaze. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You're going to regret this," the hunter spat, taking a step forward. "I don't care if you're a hero or not. She's my property, and you're going to pay for what you've done." The man lunged toward Ethan, the knife slashing through the air. Ethan barely had time to react, sidestepping the attack just in time. The pit bull, sensing Ethan was in danger, sprang into action. She lunged at the hunter, her teeth bared, but the man was quick. He swung the knife, narrowly missing her as she darted away. Ethan's heart raced. The hunter was fast, and the knife was a deadly weapon. But Ethan wasn't going to let him hurt the dog, or him. The two men circled each other, and the pit bull remained on edge, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The hunter slashed at Ethan once more, grazing his arm. The pain shot through him, but he didn't have time to focus on it. He had to protect the dog. With a roar of defiance, the pit bull attacked again, this time making contact. She caught the hunter off guard, her teeth sinking into his leg. The hunter screamed in pain, trying to shake her off, but the dog held on, her grip unrelenting. Ethan saw his chance. He moved quickly, using the hatchet to knock the knife from the hunter's hand. The man fell to the ground, clutching his leg, his face twisted in agony. "Get out of here!" Ethan yelled, as the pit bull finally released her grip, standing tall beside him. The hunter didn't need to be told twice. With a final furious glare, he turned and stumbled off into the woods, his retreating form vanishing among the trees. Ethan stood there, panting, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The pit bull looked up at him, her eyes softening with exhaustion and relief. "Good girl," Ethan whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. The danger was over. For now. But he knew it wasn't the end. Not yet. The forest was eerily quiet as Ethan helped the pit bull to her feet. Her steps were slow, but she no longer seemed as fragile as before. The adrenaline from the fight still coursed through both of them, but the air around them felt thick with something else now, something darker. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. The hunter wasn't done with them. Ethan could feel it, deep in his gut. He glanced around, scanning the dense woods for any sign of movement. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. Every rustling leaf and breaking twig made his heart race. His grip on the hatchet tightened. The hunter had disappeared for now, but Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before he came back. And this time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. He wouldn't underestimate the danger again. "You okay?" Ethan asked softly, turning his attention back to the pit bull. She was leaning against him slightly, but her eyes were steady, focused. Despite her past suffering, she seemed determined to keep moving forward. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude and admiration for her. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was his ally. And together, they had survived something terrible. But that didn't mean they were out of danger yet. The pit bull looked up at him, her tail giving a small, tentative wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure him. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He knew he couldn't keep her in the woods. They needed shelter, medical help, and most of all, a place where they could rest. With cautious steps, they began moving again. The path ahead was still shrouded in shadows, and every step felt like it might lead them into a new trap. But they couldn't afford to stop. They had to keep moving, no matter what. As they moved through the trees, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The quiet was almost suffocating. No birds, no insects, just the rustling of leaves and the soft padding of their footsteps. Ethan's mind raced, wondering what the hunter was planning. Had he given up? Or was he out there, waiting for the right moment to strike? The thought made Ethan's stomach churn. The hunter was dangerous, and as much as he wanted to believe they were safe, he knew better. The man had something to prove, and the pit bull, despite her bravery, was still weak. She couldn't keep fighting forever. Ethan turned to look at her. She was still walking, her eyes scanning their surroundings. She wasn't just following him anymore. She was leading him, in a way. Her instincts were sharp, and he trusted her judgment. If she sensed something was wrong, they had to trust that feeling. Just as they neared the edge of the forest, a sharp crack of a branch broke the silence. Ethan froze, his body instinctively going rigid. The pit bull's ears perked up, and she turned her head sharply toward the sound. There was movement ahead. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, pulling the pit bull into the cover of a nearby thicket. He dared not breathe too loudly as he peered through the dense underbrush, and then he saw him. The hunter. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man had brought reinforcements. 2 more men emerged from the trees, both carrying rifles. The trio was closing in on Ethan and the pit bull's position, moving in a triangle, systematically searching the area. They were hunting them. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't fight all 3 of them. The hunter had planned this. He had been waiting for this moment. They were in his territory now. The pit bull growled softly, her body tense, ready for action. But Ethan quickly put a hand on her back, signaling her to stay quiet. They couldn't afford to give away their position. "Stay calm," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting between him and the approaching men. Ethan tried to think, tried to plan, but his mind was clouded with panic. He knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. The men were getting closer, and their search was growing more frantic. He needed a way out. Suddenly, a memory flashed in his mind. There was a small cabin not far from here, abandoned for years, hidden deep in the woods. It was the perfect place to lay low. Ethan had stumbled across it on previous hikes, and now it was their only chance. He had to get to that cabin. It was their only hope. With one last glance at the pit bull, Ethan made up his mind. They had to move. "Follow me," he whispered urgently, keeping his voice low. The pit bull responded immediately, slipping silently behind him, her body still tense, but following his lead. They had no time to waste. Ethan moved quickly, carefully, staying low to the ground as he guided them through the dense forest. The hunters were close now. He could hear their voices, their footsteps, but he couldn't let them catch up. He had to stay ahead, had to find that cabin before it was too late. The pit bull was still with him, her steps strong despite the pain she must have been feeling. She was his protector now, just as much as he was hers, and together they had a chance. The cabin loomed ahead, its weathered walls barely visible through the thick curtain of overgrown vines and trees. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed through the underbrush, his breath shallow with panic. The pit bull was right behind him, still strong but showing signs of exhaustion. She was moving slower now, her muscles stiff from the strain of their flight. But her eyes were fierce, undeterred by the challenge ahead. She wasn't going to let him down. They had to make it to the cabin. It was their last hope, the only place where they might stand a chance. The hunters were closing in fast, their voices growing louder with every passing second. They had no time to waste. Ethan reached the cabin first, pushing the rotting door open with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked underfoot. It was an old hunting shack, abandoned for years, but it still had walls and a roof, enough to give them a fighting chance. He motioned for the pit bull to follow him inside, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. The last thing he wanted was to be trapped, cornered. The pit bull hesitated for a moment, then slipped inside, her tail low, but her body still alert. She was already positioned by the window, watching the forest outside, her ears pricked for any sound. Ethan moved to the opposite side of the room, crouching behind a broken-down chair, his eyes trained on the door. He could hear the hunters now getting closer, their footsteps unmistakable as they approached the cabin. "We don't have much time," Ethan muttered, his voice tight with fear. The pit bull glanced at him, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. They were in this together, and neither of them was going to give up. Through the small, grimy window, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement. 3 figures, cloaked in shadows, emerged from the trees. They were coming for them, and there was no way out. The cabin was surrounded. He could feel the pit bull's tension rise. She was ready to fight. He was ready to fight. "Get ready," Ethan whispered, his grip tightening around the hatchet. He didn't have a weapon that could stand up to rifles, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. Neither would she. The first hunter appeared at the door, his hand reaching for the handle. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't have much time. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged toward the door, throwing his body against it with all his weight, slamming it shut just as the hunter's hand brushed the handle. The hunter cursed loudly, banging his fist against the wood. "Get in there, you idiots," he shouted to the others. The seconds stretched into eternity. Ethan's breathing was ragged, his mind racing with what to do next. He needed a plan, but there wasn't time. They would break in. They always did. Suddenly the pit bull barked, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the tension. Ethan turned just in time to see her leap toward the door, her body low and poised for an attack. The hunter outside hadn't expected it. She collided with the door, pushing it open enough to slip through, her body a blur of motion. Ethan's heart stopped for a second. "No!" he shouted, rushing forward. But it was too late. The pit bull was already outside, facing the hunter with a determined snarl. The first hunter staggered backward, his rifle raised, but the pit bull was faster. With a growl, she lunged at him, her jaws snapping shut on his arm, knocking him to the ground. The hunter screamed in agony as he struggled to free himself, but the pit bull wouldn't let go. Her teeth were locked in place, and her eyes were filled with nothing but the instinct to protect. Ethan didn't have time to think. He dove toward the second hunter, who had begun to climb through the broken window. With one swift motion, Ethan brought the hatchet down, knocking the rifle out of the man's hands and sending him crashing to the ground. The hunter scrambled to get up, but Ethan was already on top of him, pinning him down. The third hunter, realizing what was happening, rushed toward the door, rifle raised. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. There was no way they could survive another confrontation. But the pit bull was relentless. She released the first hunter and turned to face the third, her teeth bared, her growl low and threatening. The man hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice wavering with fear. But the pit bull advanced, undeterred. Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. The dog had come so far, from the broken creature chained to a tree to this fierce, protective force. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for him. With one final powerful lunge, the pit bull knocked the third hunter to the ground, her paws pinning him to the dirt. She held him there, her body a shield between the hunter and Ethan. The battle was over. The three hunters were defeated, their weapons discarded on the ground. Ethan stood, panting, his eyes wide in disbelief. It had all happened so fast, and yet, in that moment, he knew that they had won. Not because of his strength, but because of hers. The pit bull stood over the fallen hunters, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright, alert. She was still ready to fight, if necessary. Ethan walked slowly toward her, his heart swelling with pride. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." The pit bull looked up at him, her tail giving a tired but contented wag. She had done more than save him. She had given him something he didn't even know he needed, a second chance. Ethan stood in the doorway of the cabin, his hand gripping the splintered wood as he watched the distant red and blue lights flashing through the trees. The sirens were getting closer. His chest tightened. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The pit bull, exhausted but unyielding, stood beside him. Ethan turned to her, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "What happens now?" he whispered. The pit bull looked up at him, her eyes soft yet steady. She had been through hell, but now she was here, alive, strong, and loyal. She had fought for him, saved him, and now he had to decide what kind of life she would have. As the sirens grew louder, Ethan knew there was no time left. He had one choice to make: save her, or let her be judged for the things she had done to protect him. "I'm not letting you go," Ethan said, a promise in his voice. "Not after everything we've been through." With one last look at the approaching law enforcement, he turned and walked deeper into the forest, the pit bull following at his side. They weren't just survivors. They were a family. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the hunter's voice echoed through the trees. He spun around, gripping the pit bull's collar tightly. But then, a sound from behind them, footsteps, heavy and purposeful, made Ethan freeze. It wasn't the hunter. The police had arrived. Officers emerged from the woods, their flashlights sweeping the clearing. They paused when they saw Ethan and the pit bull, their eyes narrowing. The weight of the moment hit Ethan hard. He had no choice now. "They're not a threat," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "She saved me. She's not dangerous." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, the lead officer lowered his flashlight, his expression softening. "We'll take it from here." But Ethan wasn't sure what taking it from here meant. Would they see the pit bull as a hero, or just another victim of a broken system? The pit bull stood tall beside him, her eyes locked on the officers, her loyalty clear. "We're not leaving her," Ethan said firmly. The officer nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. The pit bull had found her place, and so had Ethan. If this story touched your heart, remember, courage and loyalty can change everything. Like, share, and subscribe to help spread the message of strength and compassion. What would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.